Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of our Innovators Live series. I'm Chloe Condon, and I'm your host each week as we talk to interesting people who are doing amazing things with Google Cloud products. And this week is no exception. Of course, this week's topic is Anthropic's Claude models on Vertex AI. We're going to be talking about prompt engineering and doing a deep dive into best practices. But let's go over our agenda today. Of course, we will be doing a Vertex AI overview. We're then going to be doing an Anthropic overview to get an idea of what that is and how that works. We'll then move over to prompting Claude, very exciting topic. And then we'll talk about training prompts and move on to RAG architecture and tips. Now, remember, if you have any questions today throughout the session, we have a handy dandy chat available. And if one of our moderators doesn't answer your question, then we may answer your question live on air at the very end of this stream. So make sure to stay tuned for the whole thing. You may see your question answered live on air. So let's do a little bit of a review of what it takes to drive business value with Gen AI. It takes much more than just a model to be able to do that. And within Vertex AI, you have access to our agent builder, our model builder, and our model garden tools. So whether you're looking to prompt or serve or tune, use our retrieval engines, maybe you want to train or just need a single place to discover and customize and deploy a wide variety of models from Google or from our Google partners, Vertex AI offers support. And we're going to be diving deeper into a little bit more of that today. But what is it? Vertex Model Garden, of course, is a single environment where you can do everything from search for models. You can use it directly to test models in an environment. You can fine tune and play around and create models without code. And then, of course, you can use in notebooks. So that means using our Vertex AI workbench and use models inside of a notebook. And of course, to bring us full circle to today's topic, Anthropic's Claude models are available on Vertex AI Model Garden. Who knew? So in order to supercharge this power of Anthropic's Claude models on Vertex AI and learn all about prompt engineering, we have an extra special guest. In fact, this is an Innovators Live first. We have someone from Anthropic joining us today to give us the real scoop on the best practices of how to be using this. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our guest today. Welcome, Ellie Shopik, who's a member of the technical staff at Anthropic. Welcome, Ellie.
Thank you so much, Chloe, for having me. I'm super excited to be here, talk a little bit about how you can use Anthropic on Vertex, a little bit more about our company, and then really dive into prompt engineering, which I'm going to really try to do my best to turn this more into a science and a little bit less of maybe the art form that you might think. So without further ado, I just want to hop for a quick second and talk about who we are. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the models that we have, but who we are as a company. We are an AI safety and research lab, and our mission is to ensure transformative AI helps people and society flourish. We do that by building frontier systems and also studying them, working responsibly to deploy them, and are being very intentional with the research and science that we share. Our goal is to create models that are helpful, harmless, and honest. And we do our absolute best in the training and fine-tuning process to ensure that is the case, while also building very highly intelligent frontier models. We've been really, really proud of the ability that we've had to innovate as not a lot of time has gone on. So really since 2023, when we launched some of the much earlier models all the way until now, it's been only about 3 months from launching the Claude 3 family of models, Haiku, Sonnet, and Opus, to our latest and most intelligent model, Claude 3.5 Sonnet. So something we're really proud of is in just such a short period of time, we're able to really keep up with a tremendous amount of innovation in the space, and in many cases lead a lot of that innovation in Gen AI. Some of the things that you might not know about Anthropic, one of the most important AI innovations of 2023, as per Time Magazine, is a process called constitutional AI. And constitutional AI is where we take in some of the most well thought out and discussed principles and documents that we as a society have generated. So the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Apple's Terms of Service, and we train a special model on that to help Anthropic models become harmless, helpful, and honest. So this is a really powerful innovation that we've made that allows our models to have more aligned outputs, improved outputs, and focus on that honesty, helpfulness, and harmlessness. As you've seen many times in the Gen AI space, there are many different models. There are many different use cases for families of models. So in the enterprise AI space, there are many different constraints that you might face, from cost to latency or speed, as well as intelligence. So in the Claude family of models, we have quite a few targeting some of the more complex and more intelligent requiring tasks like agents, to some of the tools like a basic chat where you want to focus on your efficiency and speed and minimize cost. And with that, we have our family of models. We have Claude 3 Haiku, which is our fastest, most compact model. So sitting kind of in that corner of the intelligence and cost chart here. We have our Claude 3.5 Sonnet, which is our most intelligent model that we recently released, that allows kind of the best of both worlds, as well as Claude 3 Opus, which is excellent at writing and more complex tasks, a little bit more on the costly end, but very intelligent as well. So just to give you a
I
brief.
have to say, I love these naming conventions. I'm noticing a little bit of a theme: a sonnet, haiku, and opus.
Yeah, very,
You
very,
can
very
see
much so.
the
Yeah, it really leans into the length that you're going to be dealing with, and a lot of the examples that we have, and you can look in the documentation for kind of what we're dealing with for how long it's going to take to read through a book or read through a sonnet or an opus or a haiku. So definitely leaning into that terminology as we keep evolving our models. Absolutely. So what can you do with Claude? What can you do with many different things in the Gen AI ecosystem, specifically with Claude 3.5 Sonnet? There are a lot of really powerful examples, and in our documentation, we are constantly updating with use case guides as well as more technical notebooks for text generation, content moderation, coding relating tasks, classification. We just launched a couple new use case guides, especially in the classification and ticket routing side of things, and we'll keep doing more and more of that. But as there's more and more rapid innovation in this space, there's just more and more that you can do with these models, which is incredibly exciting to us as a company. Some of the things that you may have been kind of diving into, and Chloe mentioned this a little bit with the agentic capabilities, some of the models, especially Opus as well as 3.5 Sonnet, have increased agentic capabilities. And just to give you a quick overview of the idea of an agent, this is where we can assign some kind of task to a model, have the model perform the necessary steps, make the necessary function calls or API calls or routing to figure out the right next step, all programmatically and all done through generative AI. So as these models continue to get more intelligent, more efficient, this is only a pattern that we're going to just keep following more and more and more of. And there are many different infrastructures for creating agents. These can be done programmatically on your own. So many different ways to kind of offer these agentic capabilities, which is something that we're just seeing more and more of in this space. With that said, I want to shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk about something that feels relatively basic. And in fact, it's not the most complex thing, but it's really a matter of figuring out the right techniques and best practices. A lot of times when you hear prompt engineering, you might go towards the engineering side of things. And I want to lean more towards just techniques and best practices for getting the right thing or getting the thing you want out of the model. A lot of these tactics are going to be a bit specific to Claude, but if you are working with other large language models, a lot of these techniques still apply. So there might be things that you've heard of a bit before, and there might be things that hopefully you're going to learn about as we talk about prompting Claude. So at a very high overview, I'm sure many of you know this, but let's make sure we got our terminology down. What is a prompt? It's the information you pass to an LLM, a large language model, to get back a response. And what you pass inside of this prompt determines the response that you get. Not just the question that you're asking, but also some context about that question, maybe some data, some examples, some instructions. There's so much that goes into a prompt. So how do you engineer a good prompt? The same way that you would really think about engineering good code. And with that, you think about your testing first. You think about your edge cases first. So very commonly when we have companies that are working with us and using our models, we really do our absolute best to move from, instead of an art form, treat this like a science. Develop test cases. Don't forget about your edge cases, and think about, when there is a prompt, what is the ideal output, or the golden output, as we say. You can start by engineering some preliminary prompt. You can test it against use cases, and then you can refine the prompt. This part of the prompt engineering lifecycle is by far the most important, because if you go ahead and switch to a different model, if you go ahead and even use an entirely different large language model or a different version of an existing model, how do you know if the prompts that you have in production potentially are going to do any better or any worse. And that's where the entire process of evals or evaluations comes into play. We'll talk about those at a high level, but hopefully you'll get to invite me back and I can talk about evals in depth. So think of your evals as really just a unit test. If I put in this prompt and I ask this prompt some specific piece of information, do I get the answer back that I expect? And as I do that over hundreds or thousands of test prompts, am I getting consistent results? What percentage of accuracy am I getting? I can also measure things like latency or the speed. I can also be mindful of how many tokens are being used from a cost perspective. So you can really do a lot of engineering here to make sure that the prompts that you produce hold out against your evals and are ready to get into production.
And we're not looking for exact matches each time, I imagine, because I know when I'm prompting AI, sometimes we'll get a slightly different but same answer, but not the same wording. We're just trying to see if we're getting the outcome we want, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's an excellent question because it really, as with many things in Gen AI, it depends on your use case. So in this essence of something like text summarization, it would be really hard to say the summary must look exactly like this. That's where you need to use either large language models to help you with your eval or potential string matching or patterns for just looking for particular things. If it's a case of maybe classification where the answer is either something from a category or some specific data structure that you know what it's going to look like, you might have a chance to do a bit more of that exact matching. But you're spot on with not every single use case is always going to be a perfect match. Sometimes it's something similar, and that's where you have to iterate, and it all depends on your use case. That's an excellent point.
As a developer relations engineer, that is always fun when it comes to making documentation. I think we're so used to saying this output will happen, but since AI is learning all the time, it's been an interesting thing to adjust to. Just like you said, prompting is deceptively it's not as simple as I think people paint it out to be.
Absolutely, yeah. And I'm excited to show you actually as we get into some of those tools to make this a little bit easier to work with, because many times you might read some documentation, you might read some guides on prompting and best practices, and they might actually point you towards something that feels a bit like this. You want to put in your prompt the context for your task. You want to put in the tone. You want to think about background data and examples and a history and thinking step by step. And don't forget to make sure that your model knows how to think and think about pre-filling. And it's going to get really hard to keep that all in your brain or memorize some kind of acronym for all the things that you need or think about all the colors that we have here. So the way that we think about prompt engineering at Anthropic, especially for our customers, is don't start from scratch. We already have lots of good practices. We already have lots of good ideas for how best to work with these models. So instead, let's actually start in reverse. And we've introduced a tool here, and I'm going to show you in a second, called the meta prompter. And what we actually have here is you as the user put in the thing you're trying to do. We then will use Claude to write a prompt for you with all the best practices that allows you to then work off of that prompt and have something that you can build off of, because it's very difficult to just start engineering with a prompt from scratch, especially if you're even coming from a different language model and you're trying to adopt different practices. So let's see what that looks like. I'm going to hop
So
over
we're
here.
using AI to help with our AI prompting.
Yes, hence the term meta prompting. Exactly. That is
Wow.
exactly it. So I am at the Anthropic console. That's console.anthropic.com. And I'm going to go to the prompt generator or meta prompter, whatever word you want to use there. I'm going to use AI to use AI, just like you said, Chloe. So you can put in the particular task that you want at hand. I'm just going to pick one of these just to show you as an example. I'm going to draft an email responding to a customer complaint and offer a resolution. Let's imagine for some reason you're very upset with what happens in this hour, and we need Claude to help us out and offer some resolution. But hopefully that is not the case. So we'll give this a second to kind of work its magic. But what you're going to see here is a whole bunch of text. This is being generated from Claude. And this right here is a great place for us to start working from. Once we continue, we can actually go ahead and stay here. And we're going to be taken to our workbench. This is all inside of the console. And this allows us to work with the prompt. Maybe you're tasked with drafting a professional and empathetic. So maybe I don't necessarily want empathetic. I want a strongly worded. I can go ahead and change this as much as I want. What I've gotten out of the box is just the meta prompter. Not only can I start working with this, I can go ahead and just grab the code for that. So let's go ahead and use the Vertex AI SDK to do so. And I've got that right here to work with. So a lot of times the code necessary to talk to the LLM is not terribly complex, but just getting that boilerplate is really nice. I can hop to the docs, I can copy that code, throw it in a notebook, throw it in a script, go on with my day. In this case, we're given some variables. So in our prompt, we are given some, for example, here's what that complaint might look like. Here's what the company name might look like. Here are the resolution options. If I am just needing to generate some simple data for this prompt, it's kind of hard for me even to just think of examples from scratch. So again, let's just use generative AI to help us out. Walk me through the logic that you're thinking about for generating these example inputs, just so that I can have something to work with. So instead of me trying to write an example of a complaint email, I'm just going to use Gen AI to do that. It's now going to fill in the blanks here. I can actually see the logic that it's using under the hood for generating these examples. So the goal here is to start with something, build for yourself a workbench where you can actually start putting in some dummy data and seeing what you get back. In this response, we're going to see an example of this email, and here is where we can take this data and we can evaluate it against something. So in this case, we're not necessarily going to find the perfect response here, but maybe we want to make sure that we're seeing things with reply to this email. We want to make sure we're seeing the word refund with credit card and check. We want to make sure that we mention 2 to 3 business days. That could be part of our evaluation suite. Talking about evaluation suites, we can go ahead and hop to this section here on evaluate. And you can see right here, here are the variables, here's the prompt, and I can now go ahead and assign a grade to these evals. I can export these, I can import test cases. I can even just generate a bunch of test cases. So for example, pick some new things, tell me what the response is. Let's go ahead and see what you get. You can move this to a different place programmatically. You can move this in a CSV. This idea of just building infrastructure so that you can prompt the right way is incredibly valuable, and it just helps you not have to do things from scratch. The hardest part with prompt engineering is you start with something, you build on it, you build on it, you build on it. You kind of have this house of cards, and then it's not doing what you want it to do, and you don't necessarily know why. So really helpful to kind of think about the testing first, think about the evaluations first. Can't stress that enough. If you feel good about what you have, you're excellent, but here's an opportunity to now compare that to a different prompt that you have. And this now gives you the ability to run, given these variables, different prompts to get different responses and see which one works better. This is something that even if you are not necessarily technical, that's not a problem. You don't need to know any Python to make this work. You just need to log in and start working with it. So you have a lot of functionality within this workbench. You also have the ability to tweak many different things. So I'll kind of leave that to you to explore some more. But this is a really powerful tool for just getting up and running and testing your prompts.
And I love that it's all in one place. I'm not having to context switch or click around, that I can just have everything in one spot, play around a little bit, compare side by side. I have to say, when you showed that rainbow visual, I got very excited as a visual
Ah,
person. Because I thought, if only there was a way to
mm.
automate this. So
It's a
is it?
really pretty slide, which is why we show it first and then we show you the meta prompter. But yes, it is definitely, it's got lots of colors and is super pretty, but with that comes the complexity that you just mentioned. So you could
Yeah, I
definitely,
was thinking Roy, G, Biv, Anthropic.
yeah, exactly. There
Like,
you go.
what is all
That's
in
the
one place?
acronym that you need. Yeah, that is spot on. So thankfully we have an easier tool to do that, and that is our meta prompter. So the idea here, again, we capture the best practices. We're constantly iterating on this as we figure out more and more of the best practices. One of the things that is just a constant era or place of discovery is figuring out the best ways to prompt these LLMs. It's something that is just changing as newer models are released, as different research techniques are released, different prompting techniques are released. So being able to kind of stay on top of that without you having to keep that all in your head can be extremely, extremely helpful. So with that said, you're going to get a prompt generated for you. Let's just talk about some of the important parts of that prompt. When you are prompting, you want to make sure you have some kind of role and high level task for what you would like the LLM to do. Many times people kind of take this to an extreme, like you are the smartest mathematician in the world. You have 15 PhDs from the most respected institutions in the world. You can solve any math problem. There's only so much hyping up of Claude that you can do. So instead, clear and concise, and just stick to the role and the task that you have at hand. Right after that, You want to put in your dynamic content. You want to put in any external data that you are retrieving. That's where that goes right there. So right under that, that's where the dynamic content, in our case, these variables, or if you're using RAG, which we'll talk about a little bit later, embed that right here. The next step you want to be mindful of is detailed instructions. And many times you might hear things like this idea of chain of thought, or make sure that you tell your large language model to think step by step. And just those words, think step by step, can be very beneficial. But I really want to push you all to just do a little bit more. Instead of just saying think step by step, what are the actual steps? What is the thinking that you want? Or what is the thinking that you want to see from Claude so that you can then get a sense of, in the prompt, maybe what you need to shift to steer Claude in the direction of the thinking that you might want. So you'll see when you generate those meta prompts, or even when writing prompts on your own, thinking step by step can be extremely helpful, but you really want to lean more into that piece. The next step that you want to get to, you'll see this idea with n-shot prompting, 3-shot, 5-shot, 10-shot. Sounds like a Dr. Seuss book, but this is n-shot prompting, or the number of examples that you want to provide. Examples can be extremely, extremely helpful, especially when you want things to follow an exact path or kind of rigid output or structure. There is no one magical answer for the exact number of examples that you need, but to start, 3 to 5 is a great place. If there are critical instructions, put them at the end and repeat them. And that can be extremely, extremely helpful for just staying on task. Another piece that you're going to see a lot in Claude prompts are XML tags. For those of you not familiar with XML, you might be familiar with HTML. These are just tags that you use to build web pages. And XML tags follow a very similar structure. You just pick the name of the tags. So instead of h1, div, body, span, you get to make them up. The purpose of these XML tags is to help Claude comprehend the organization of your data. Claude is trained on XML tags. It's also trained on a tremendous amount of things on the internet and HTML. So it has the ability to figure out, in terms of where you want to put your data. XML tags are a very, very helpful way to do that. They're not necessarily required, but it's a really wise idea, especially as you have much larger prompts, to help Claude organize its thinking for knowing what goes where. As we mentioned with these examples, you really want to lean into the relevance of your examples. Obviously, you want an example that's going to indicate what you're looking for, but you also want to think a lot about the diversity of examples. So if you're just providing the same example over and over again, but you've changed one or two things, that might not be the most helpful. So think a lot, especially with potential edge cases, about the diversity of your examples. Many times, instead of just giving examples in a lot of depth, it can be helpful to just show Claude what you are trying to get out. So instead of trying to describe your example with all this text, sometimes it's as simple as, here's the input I want, here's the output I want, here's the question I want, here's the answer I want. So this is also where being a little bit more on the shorter and concise part can be very beneficial. One of the things that we see a lot of times with prompts when we are debugging or triaging prompts, and we'll talk about that a little bit, are just these massive prompts that have so much text that you would look at and just say, I have no idea what to do with this thing. And that's actually where the golden rule of prompting came to be. The golden rule of prompting is, again, this is going to sound very simple, but you'd be shocked. Can you take the prompt that you've written? Can you hand it to the person next to you, in front of you, behind you, above you? And can they just understand what you're trying to do? Sometimes debugging a prompt is really as simple as, can you just do that part? Because a lot of prompts get really unwieldy. You might have tons of conditional logic or all sorts of fancy things you're trying to do. A lot of times those don't really move the needle. They sometimes even hurt you. Another piece that you might have seen before, and you can see this with a lot of different large language models, is you can start to put words in Claude's mouth. This can be very helpful for steering the behavior, having control over the format. But what you can do is, in the assistant field, the way that Claude works is you have a user who puts in some content, and then the assistant is what Claude gives you back. You can actually start by pre-filling Claude's response. You can give it the start of the JSON output that you want. You can give it the start of the XML tag you're looking for. You can give it the start of some preamble so that Claude kind of picks up where you left off. So depending on your use case, you can really be mindful of, if I'm not getting things that I want in a particular lane, can you start to give Claude kind of a little nudge for, here's where I want you to begin, you take over from here.
It's almost like doing a group project with Claude. I
Yeah.
did the first part. Here's the rest.
And the good news is here, you don't actually have to work that hard on the group project, and you can still get an excellent grade. So you can be that person in the group I was in school. When you think about things like RAG, dynamic data, like we mentioned, you want to put that long information at the top after you specify your role. And this actually does make a difference in the quality of your prompts and the outputs that you get. So this is one of those places where order can be very important. Again, if you don't remember it, that's all good. That's what the meta prompter is there for. When you're working with long context, when you have a lot of information, a lot of text inside of one prompt, or you're retrieving lots of examples and you just have a ton of text, to minimize hallucinations, to minimize the LLM saying something that may be incorrect, or even saying, I don't know, you can ask Claude to find relevant quotes before answering. You can also ask Claude to share those quotes with you so that you have citations. You can stay a little bit more grounded in the truth. You can also have Claude read the document carefully because it will be asked questions later. And you might look at this and say, well, it's not like Claude is going to take 10 more seconds to read the document because I said so. But again, little things like this can really move the needle. So
And
for
does
example,
that help with
yeah,
efficiency, like being able to get to the answer faster, or maybe, doing more of a breadth versus a depth search in this instance? Or
it's
why are we being
definitely more of the breadth there. We're really just trying to stay grounded in accuracy. So we're really just trying to do everything we can to preempt the model to give us the most accurate response. And that's kind of where the sometimes thinking step by step can produce better quality answers. Saying things like read the document carefully because I'm going to ask you questions about it can produce answers that are either grounded or prompts Claude to say things like I don't know, which can be equally as valuable because nothing is worse than your model saying something that is just clearly not true, because every model gives every answer with the utmost confidence. We don't really have a kind of confidence meter out of the box that we can get. So this is where just focusing on that kind of breadth, I would say, so that you make sure that it's going to give you the most grounded answer is where we're getting to.
It's like telling Claude there will be a test.
Well, there you go. Exactly. The same way that if you're in a classroom and the teacher says there's going to be a quiz at the end of this, you're probably more likely to listen to what the teacher has to say. So that's my bad. I should have said there's going to be a quiz before I started here. Some best practices as you start working with large language models: provide as much situational context as possible. So when we talk about that kind of role that you're talking about, instead of just asking Claude for something, try to give Claude some context for who you are, what information is useful, what you need, or if this is for a customer, any customer specific context. For example, a decent prompt might just say something like, explain to me in brief how RAG works, and you'll probably get a pretty decent answer. But depending on the kind of answer that you want, granted, yes, this does take a little bit more text to put in, and again, the meta prompter can be very helpful, but really kind of setting the stage for what you want the output to be. This can save you a lot of back and forth with the LLM, because many times you might just say something like, explain RAG to me. Okay, that was good, but I'm an account executive and I'm preparing for a meeting. Try it again. Oh, actually, the client's in the financial sector, so try it again. Actually, make your answer pretty convincing. This is where just providing that situational context, thinking a little bit more before you jump to get an answer out, can be really, really helpful. As we talk a little bit about those thinking instructions, remember, telling Claude to think step by step, telling your model to think step by step can be beneficial and has been shown to be beneficial in very interesting papers. But as we kind of go to the next step around that, we want to think a lot about not just tell Claude to think, but how should Claude think? What are any details? What are any steps? What is the thinking process you want Claude to take? The same way that if you're trying to teach something to someone, you might just not tell them, go solve the problem. You might say something like, show your work, or go through it step by step. Here are the steps that I want you to take. So, for example, how can we make this a little bit better with some thought instructions? We're getting to the role, we're talking about who we are, and then we're doing a pretty nice job for, hey, I have a general understanding of AI, but no technical background, so you don't need to explain RAG to me as if I don't know anything about AI. I need to be able to explain this to an audience that's non-technical while addressing concerns for technical folks. So how can we make this better with some thought instructions? Let's go ahead and take a look at one example here. Granted, you look at this and it's oh man, there's just like a lot of text I need to write. Sometimes, yeah, again, the meta prompter can be very helpful for that. But when you are going through prompts yourself, it can be really useful to kind of dive into what's happening here. So brainstorm the information that'll be most important, and then be sure to account for these things, and then brainstorm what information I can highlight. The reason why this is also very beneficial is because you can ask Claude to output its thought in thinking tags, in a scratchpad tag, whatever you want to choose for your tag, and you will actually see what Claude is thinking as it gets you an answer. And that can be really beneficial when you go back and say, oh, turns out you're actually thinking about this in a different way. I'd like you to go ahead and change the way that you're thinking. And that's going to produce a really optimal output. So we've got some really good practices for building prompts. However, many times in the real world, you are either given a prompt or you are working on some existing prompt and it's not doing what you want it to do. So I want to shift gears a little bit to triaging prompts. Triaging prompts meaning you have a prompt, something's not working. What do you do? What info do you need? So whether that's a customer or someone on your team is just saying, the customer is reporting that the prompt is not doing what we want it to do. What info do you need? First and foremost, you want to have the use case and the prompt. So you want to make sure it's very hard to debug prompts when you don't actually have the prompt. So if you're just saying, hey, we're getting an output of true when it should be false, you want to make sure you know what's going on here. So when there is a problem, make sure you analyze the full use case and the prompt, some examples, and potentially the problematic output and the ideal output. Again, this is where having evals or evaluations can be really, really helpful. So I'm going to talk through this little piece, and then I'm actually going to show you a course that we have that is on our courses GitHub that uses Vertex, where you can practice yourself for how to tweak those prompts. So we're going to step through these triaging processes, and then I'm going to give you a brief introduction to our course. We'll talk about RAG, and then we'll have some time for Q&A. First thing, again, I know it's sometimes seems a bit silly, but you'd be surprised how many people try to just jump to brainstorming things. Just read the prompt. Does it follow that golden rule? Can you explain it to the person next to you? Do you actually understand the issue? And then think about what solutions you might have. And if there are other things you need to think about, get to it. But really try to be scientific in this process. Does the prompt make sense? Again, this golden rule here, can I give it to someone else? If I receive this prompt as instructions, could I do the task successfully? A lot of this is really just organization. Sometimes you might look at this and say, wow, you have examples at the top, and then you have examples at the bottom, then you have instructions in the middle, then you have instructions at the bottom that seem to contradict the instructions in the middle. When these prompts get bigger and bigger and bigger as you try to just handle more and more and more, in many cases, these are actually the problems that you run into. Again, make sure you understand the issue, identify the possible cause. Is Claude trying to be too helpful? Is Claude not helpful enough? Are there no explicit instructions on how to ground its response in the truth? This is really the number one thing for minimizing hallucinations. You have to ask Claude to check its work. You have to ask Claude to provide citations. You have to ask Claude, sometimes if you really don't know, say, I don't know. If there is a low accuracy, here are some really good questions to dive into. And many times it's really as simple as these first couple things. Is your prompt just way too big? Are there way too many complicated instructions? Could a human look at this and just say, I have no idea where to even start? Is there a lack of specific instructions? Many times, many different people work on the same prompt and they find that they're actually repeating themselves with slightly different wording, and that just reduces the accuracy because you're trying to just have Claude do too much. So a lot of times it's really just reading, dissecting, thinking about those best practices, even taking the task, running it through the meta prompter and just comparing side by side, what's the meta prompter giving me? What does my structure look like? Where can I begin there? Is Claude mistaking a harmless task as harmful? Like I mentioned, we spend a lot of time and a lot of thought into refusals, into making sure that things that are not appropriate are not being used in any way in our ecosystem. That does open the opportunity for a potential harmless task as harmful. Are there ways that we can be mindful to steer Claude in pre-filling the response or in the text of the prompt for making sure that we're getting things that may actually be totally harmless to not have Claude kind of come in and think that it's harmful? Do we have enough examples? Does the prompt have a clear structure? So many times, really just these relatively simple things that cause a lot of problems, a lot of headache. If Claude is trying to be overly helpful, tell it how to be helpful while being accurate. Tell it how to say, I don't know, be short and succinct. If there's no instruction for how to ground things in the truth, just like we saw, get quotes, answer based on the quotes, show those quotes, cite your sources, the same way you'd ask someone if they're presenting something, where are you getting that information from? Cite your sources. Have Claude check over its own work as well. What I want to do for one brief moment is actually take a step back and think about why the answer you get from an LLM might not actually be what you expect. At the end of the day, the way that these models work is a very kind of fancy sounding process called autoregressive generation, which is simply just taking in some input and figuring out the highest probability for the very first small piece of output. And then we take the next step and do the exact same thing, and the next step and do the exact same thing, and do the next step and do the exact same thing. And we do that until we either finish the response or run out of tokens or someone tells us to stop. But it's simply just this process of seeing what we've done before and recalculating over and over again for the next thing. The reason why it's so important to have this mental model is because when you get an output, when you get a response from an LLM, it's not just all coming at once. It is actually step by step figured out what is the next word, what's the next piece of the word, what's the next piece of the word, what's the next piece of the word. So when you are debugging a particular output, try to think for yourself, how did I get to this output? How did I end up with the very last character, the very last token, the very last word even in the particular output that I had? It's because the thing before it said, the most likely thing that follows is what you're seeing. So think about your outputs from LLMs as being generated step by step. And there is some reason why it got to that step. So maybe instead of just looking at the last thing the model gives you, take a look at the entire output and see maybe where things went wrong. And that's where you can debug appropriately. Many different reasons why things can get better. Claude doesn't understand, there are not enough examples, the prompt lacks structure, and so on. Many different issues, many different solutions that you can look into. We have a lot of all this good stuff in the course that I'm going to share, so I'll go through this relatively quickly. Like we mentioned, pre-filling responses, more examples are better. Prompt lacks clear structure, create those sections with XML tags. Once you've got some improvements, what do you go and delete? What do you go and rewrite? Kind of like with code sometimes, it's really nice to just delete things, and it feels really good when you just have lots of deletions and things are shorter and more concise and readable and such. Treat your prompts the same way. Again, you can always check your improvements in the console. You can always compare the results using that evaluation suite and that workbench that we have. If for some reason you need to break the prompt into smaller prompts, you need an intent classifier, there are many different advanced techniques for dealing with prompting, and that's a whole other discussion for another time. But most of the time, before you jump for things like fine-tuning, before you jump for intent classifiers or other decision trees or more advanced patterns, a lot of these steps here are going to solve problems. And this is what we've seen with so many customers, that it's actually these things that get you in trouble, but these things that are also relatively easy to fix in the scheme of things. Before we shift to RAG, I want to just briefly walk through a course that we have. This is on our courses website, and I'll go ahead and share that link with you, make sure you all have it. This is a real-world prompting course that we've made, and it uses Vertex exclusively. I'm using the command line to log in, but you can do this really anywhere. You can put this in your own notebook. You can open this in a collab, but here's the interface that I'm using. It has 5 sections. The first part is a prompting recap. So very similar to what we talked about, but if you want to see this kind of in a notebook format, you want to see a little bit more in the screenshots, you want to see some examples of input text and generated prompts, this is a really good place to start. The second section that we have is an example with a medical prompt. So we are going to take some of those ideas that we saw in the first lesson, and we're going to use a real world prompt. This is not customer data by any means. This is all just kind of made up stuff and synthetic data that we have here. But we're going to go ahead and take some patient records, and we're going to generate some summaries from those records. We're going to start with prompts that are not great. Again, I have this record. Can you summarize it for me? I need this quickly. Again, you might just find yourself writing prompts like this, and you might not get the responses that you want. To give you a little bit of an idea of how this works with Vertex, not a terrible amount of code necessary. Even if you've used other SDKs or our SDK, it's very similar. You go ahead and just use this create function that's built on our client messages object, and all that comes in from Anthropic Vertex. So initialize the Anthropic Vertex instance, and then go ahead and using the messages API, create a message, start a conversation with the large language model. Just to show you what that looks like, I'm going to go ahead and log in, make sure that I'm authenticated before I go ahead and do that. So I'll hop over here, log in with the Google Auth library. And Chloe, I'm sure they're many different ways that folks can do this. This is just the way that I'm showing you right now, but you can do this in the model garden. You can do this with enterprise notebooks. You can do this in Colab and Authenticate. So many different ways to tackle this particular piece. Once you're logged in, you can go ahead and start calling Claude. And here, I'll go ahead and make sure I actually have those patient records. Might yell at me for not having those yet. So we'll go ahead and generate that summary. And here's a summary that we get back. So this is simply just the conversation that you can have with the LLM. Here's the code necessary to get up and running. It's relatively minimal because the focus here is not doing very complex things with the SDK. It's really focusing on prompting. So you can scroll through, you can see some examples of good prompts and bad prompts. You can take a little bit more in depth of prompt engineering and the engineering lifecycle, all things that we've spoken about. But if you want to see it again and run some examples, this is a great place to do so. And then we got 2 sections at the end, one for the call summarizer, which builds up a very simple prompt into more complicated ideas. And then the last example that I definitely recommend looking through, which is essentially the triaging of a prompt, where we start with the prompt. Here's all the information that we get about Acme OS. We have a system prompt. We have a prompt that seems to be doing decent enough, but here we're going to start layering on edge cases and examples and so on. So definitely want to point you in that direction for a really nice resource to practice with those pieces. We'll make sure you all have a link to that GitHub as we get to wrap up here. Going back to RAG architecture and tips, I want to wrap up with this little piece here. Retrieval-Augmented Generation is a super common term that you've heard in this industry. And if you have not heard about it, no worries. I will explain the idea. The idea here is retrieving information that your large language model does not know about or may partially know about. So the most common example is your company's data, your internal data, your own personal family history, even things that are after the time at which the model has been trained. So if that's after April 2024 or August 23 or whatever the cutoff date of training is, you might want to augment the knowledge that your large language model has. With RAG, most of the work is done with that R. Most of the work is done in that retrieval. The augmenting and generation is simply just taking the stuff you get back and generating a new input. So the R in RAG is really where most of the work is done. But what's the obvious advantage here? You want to start using Claude for your own internal company's data, or you want to make a knowledge base of your company's documentation, obviously something that Claude is not trained on. This is how we can augment the LLM with external knowledge. A basic RAG architecture looks like this. Someone asks a question. We take that question and we generate an embedding, which is really just a list of lots of floating point numbers that represent the semantic meaning of what we're looking for. We then try to find things that are similar in semantic meaning in some kind of database, very commonly a vector database. We take all our information that is external, we put it in a vector database, we find similar records, and then we take that data and put it into our prompt. And now Claude can do all of its wonderful work with this additional context. This is a very simple flow with a RAG architecture. This can obviously scale and get infinitely more complex, but here's a basic idea of a RAG architecture and RAG setup. The things that you have to do to get this to work, you have to have some information, your company's documentation, your company's data, your medical records, whatever it may be that you want to vectorize, and you got to put that in a vector database. You then have to take a query that comes in and embed it using some embedding model and find similar searches in your vector database. There are lots of different tools for this. There are lots of different models that can do these embeddings. Vertex has an entire garden of tools to help you here. So this is where you can really lean on the ecosystem that Vertex has, and many different companies offer these solutions. As we start to shift a bit more in complexity, something that we haven't covered too much here that we can maybe cover in a future section is the idea of tool use. And tool use is, instead of Claude saying something like, I don't know the answer, we can tell Claude, hey, if someone's asking about something like, what's the weather right now? Or what is a great gift for a 5-year-old in my product catalog? Instead of Claude saying, I don't know, Claude can actually tell us as the developer, hey, looks like someone's trying to search for some products. Here's a tool that I know about. Go do what you want with it. We can then programmatically take that information, go ahead and call an API, search things in a database. The reason why RAG and tool use are used together so commonly is because many times you don't necessarily need to jump for embedding in a vector database and so on. If someone just asks Claude something like, what is the difference between the number 3 and the number 7? Claude could probably give you a decent answer for that. If you ask Claude a question like, can you explain what a large language model is? You might not need to go and do this embedding and vectorization and so on. So as you get more comfortable with these pipelines and these ideas, a lot of times you don't always have to jump for it. So this is just one example, and hopefully in a future session, we can talk about tool use and evals and all sorts of fun things in this ecosystem. When you have external documents and you feed them to Claude, the recommended format that we have is to actually use these XML tags, documents, and then inside have a document with a source and a document content. This sometimes takes a little bit of finagling or working with code on your end, but this is how Claude has been trained on many different kinds of documents with these particular tags. This also allows you to add a particular unique identifier for each parts of the document. You can put in your own metadata as well, but this can lead to much more effective results from retrieval from systems that Claude is not aware of out of the box. So just a small little note if you're working with RAG, with Claude, this is a reference for you to kind of think about that ingesting and the right way to structure your data. Some tips in the RAG ecosystem. Like we mentioned, one of the hardest things to do in RAG is the R, that retrieval process. If someone puts in a really, 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 really long query, how are we going to figure out what it is exactly that they're looking for? When we take our company's documentation, we can't just put all the documentation in one record in the database. We have to break it up into smaller chunks. There's only so much that we can embed at a time. So how do we preserve the semantic meaning? How do we preserve the order and the accuracy of our data when we have to literally chop it up and chop it up and chop it up? That process of chunking is something that you want to be really mindful of and can lead to lots of different kinds of challenges in this ecosystem. There's another really interesting technique that you can use in RAG called re-ranking, which is where you can take the query that you have or take the information that the user is trying to search for, and you can re-rank the results by having a large language model try to rewrite what the user is looking for to be more accurate. So you can actually use a large language model to rewrite the query that the user has to figure out a potential different ranking for the best possible option. All slightly more advanced ideas, but things that you will probably come across when hearing about RAG, hearing this terminology, and so on. RAG has been kind of the de facto solution that many, many, many folks do reach for. But as we evolve in this ecosystem, kind of want to just put some things in your brain for what might change in the future as we go along. So as more optimizations come out, external knowledge search will absolutely improve. External knowledge search is an essential part of what you do when working with large language models. It can be great to talk to an LLM, but if you're using this for your company, you're going to have your own kind of knowledge that you need to be retrieved. RAG is a great solution out of the box, but it runs into some problems, especially with making sure you're getting accurate results, making sure you're being efficient in your searching. It can be tweaked a lot. But some alternatives as we start getting more and more in this ecosystem. Prompt caching is a technique that is becoming more and more popular. Prompt caching is the idea where we're sending really long conversations, we're putting lots of information in the context, but after each message, we have to recreate all those tokens again. We have to generate all those tokens again. Can we instead kind of take a picture, take a snapshot, take those tokens and store them in a cache so that we don't have to keep tokenizing, regenerating tokens over and over and over again? This would allow us to put lots of information in a prompt, tons of information that normally every time might take too long to load. But instead, we can take all this information, we can cache it so that when we look at it again, we're going to load it much, much faster. So can you take some of that documentation and instead of a external data source, you can just put it in the prompt and cache it? As larger context windows come in, as the amount or total amount of tokens that we can have over the course of an entire conversation grows, we're getting to, levels of hundreds of thousands, million, and so on. This might avoid the need for RAG because we can just put everything in the context window. As we have better embedding models, as we have different kinds of data stores, this will continue to only improve. So RAG is something that I don't know what it'll look like over the next 6 months or year or so on, but it is constantly going through changes, iterations, and improvements.
All right. We have some awesome questions. I can tell people are really enjoying this session because we've got some very specific questions for you, Ellie. So
Oh,
I'll
cool.
start
Great.
with this first one. This was from Charlie, and Charlie asks, what are some cool use cases you've seen using prompt engineering?
Wow. Cool use cases that I've seen using prompt engineering. There is a tremendous amount here. I think some of the most impressive things that I've seen, or some of the things that I'm personally most excited about, are the medical field and the amount of research that we can do, or the partnerships that we can establish to drive innovation forward in this space, to honestly just make the world a better place in general. There is so much that is unknown, and there's only more that's going to be known by using LLMs and such. In terms of the general day-to-day use cases for things like prompt engineering, we've just seen so many customers go from seeing data that they're not expecting, or things are not great, or things are hallucinating, and just by following the steps in the meta prompter, even just 10-15 minutes of triaging, debugging just leads to a completely different result. So the thing that I'm actually excited about is just trying to get people to not necessarily give up if the LLM is not giving you what you want out of the box, kind of lean into these steps. But long term, the medical space; short term, just seeing customer wins across so many different use cases. Customer support, obviously, chatbots are a big piece. Financial tools, there's just so much you can do here.
Yeah, solving that issue of always having to be like agent, agent, getting to those
Yes,
answers more efficiently.
100%.
All right. This next one is from John. John asks, is the prompt engineering dashboard available for professional accounts or business accounts, or is this a separate product?
So the dashboard, I guess, that you saw, the kind of workbench and so on, as long as you have an Anthropic account, that is something that you can use. And whether you are part of Claude for Work or Enterprise, or doing this individually, as long as you have an account, you can go ahead and use that. You'll need to set up a API key for yourself. There's some billing that needs to happen, but it is extremely easy to get started for individuals, and then organizations can share those workbenches as well.
Great. This question is from Jan, or Jan perhaps. Do the prompt improvements discussed here take part when doing meta prompting?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a fantastic question. So we have a entire team focused on prompt engineering and research, and all that they do is really just try to meta prompt the meta prompt and figure out all different kinds of ways, especially as our models evolve, as our models get smarter, as the techniques that maybe once worked for things like Claude 1 or 2 or 2.1 have totally changed. We are constantly iterating on that meta prompter, and we've made the meta prompter completely available. It's a Jupyter notebook. You can find it in our documentation. So that's something that we've shared with the entire world, but it's also something that we're constantly iterating on. So every day, every week or so, there are always little things, little tweaks that we try to think about to incorporate to just deliver the best quality prompts.
Nice. All right. James asks, how would you apply evals to more complex workflows, such as multi-agent workflows that utilize tools as part of the task?
Excellent question. Well, you have to bring me back to talk about evals. But in this one question, I will definitely tell you there are lots of different ways for doing evals. There is the very tedious human grading side of things, which even we point towards. You want to try to avoid that because it just doesn't scale. For things like multi-agent use or step-by-step processes, the best thing to do is to start with evals on each of those individual levels. Because if the eval, for example, is you expect some kind of large agentic workflow to produce some output, and then the eval is just, is the output what I want? Unless you've set up everything so properly and correctly, it's unlikely that you're going to get the results you want. And then debugging and triaging is going to be very difficult. So the same way that you would write unit tests, and then on top of that write integration tests, I would try to lean on that same kind of philosophy and idea. When you are testing things, again, depends on your use case. Sometimes programmatically, it can be as simple as, I expect that the output contains this word. I expect that the output contains these particular pieces. Sometimes you also need to use an LLM to do some of the grading as well. So especially with agentic workflows, we've seen models grading other models, specifically models with different tiers of intelligence grading other models on certain parts of the process. So this is where, the same way that you have a agentic workflow with lots of different steps, you now have an evaluation suite with lots of different steps, checking things along the way so that if the output is not what you want, you know kind of how things are gotten to throughout that process.
Neat. All right, we have a question from Saba. Saba asks, dynamic content slash RAG, step two, also covers tools listing. How
Mhm.
about chat history? What should be the order of RAG, doc snippets, tool slash function listing, tool return results, and chat history?
Definitely. So the chat history, if you have a prompt and you're then injecting the chat history, that's a little bit different. If you have the entire kind of back and forth conversation, the chat history is preserved. So I'll start kind of with the tool side of things. The tool definitions come in when the prompt is created. So there's a key called tools, and you pass in the definition of your tools. But in terms of what you want the ideal output to look like with a particular tool, or you want to give some examples of what that tool might look like, that just goes in the examples section. So any possibility for that N shot or 5 shot or 10 shot prompting, think of those kind of tools as the place to put that there. RAG, again, kind of top of the document and dynamic information. That's where I would put that content. And then for the chat history, depending on kind of where you're storing the history, that might be a little bit tricky, but that also would be kind of in your examples section. So breaking those 3 areas apart is what I would do.
Great. And then I think we have time for one more question. Let's take this one from Chris. Chris asks, does Claude have a sense of how certain it is in its answer? Can it give a useful confidence score?
That's a fantastic, fantastic question. So there's a tremendous amount of research that we do about how Claude gets to the answer on the entire field of interpretability, trying to figure out kind of what's happening under the hood at the neuron level. Right out of the box, there is no way to have a kind of confidence score and so on. The way that you can try to get more of those accuracy scores are when you use tools like RAG, where you can basically ask from the query that the person has put in, what is the similarity to other records that we have or other embeddings that we have? What is that kind of similarity score? And there's a metric called cosine similarity. There are a couple of other metrics that kind of give you a level of accuracy or similarity. That's where you'll see a little bit more of that kind of confidence score, like, red or yellow or green, or a 66% chance that this is what you're looking for. But out of the box, if you ask Claude something and you say, on a scale to 10, 0 to 10, how confident are you? You're going to have a hard time kind of getting that measure to be pretty sustainable.
And I lied. We have time for one more question, so I'm going to sneak one more in for you. This is from Linda. How does Claude handle potential inconsistencies or contradictions in retrieved information?
These are excellent questions. So when there are potential inconsistencies, it's hard for Claude to kind of know historically what all the inconsistencies have been and such. So this kind of goes back to this is where the R in retrieval is a tricky process. This is where re-ranking can also be really helpful. But at the same time, you can still always ask Claude for cite the sources, make sure that the data here has been backed by sources, and show me where you found these sources. And that's always a really helpful way to kind of ground Claude in the truth. The same way that you want to just make sure that if there's a world in which the answer is not known, you can have Claude just explicitly say, I don't know, and make sure that that's part of your prompt as well. So it's a slightly more difficult thing to do past the retrieval stage, because that's really where the data is being retrieved. And it's hard for Claude to say, your embedding model was wrong. That's not really possible, but you can still do your best to kind of stop things and use Claude as your last line of defense.
Great. Well, I have learned so much today. Thank you so much for sharing all of these best practices. Any parting thoughts, wisdom you want to share with our audience about prompt engineering, Anthropic, XML tags,
Oh
whatever
man,
it may be?
XML tags. Where to begin? No, I think follow that golden rule with prompting. Really try to treat prompt engineering as a science instead of an art. And if the first thing you get back from the LLM is not what you expect, do your best to not get too frustrated and realize there's an entire world of evolving to get what you're looking for.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Ellie. And this has been so exciting to have real use cases and examples shown on the show. So thank you so much for speaking to our audience today. And I'm sure we're going to get a lot of folks maybe tweeting you, reaching out, asking questions.
Absolutely.
And that is the end of our stream today. Thank you so much for everybody who joined us live, or if you're joining us on demand in the future. Hello. And we will wrap up today's session. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.